Hello, Mayhem family. My name is Dr. Kelly Starrett, and welcome to the Mayhem Ready week-long on-ramp program. What we're going to attempt to do in the next 7 days is give you a really simple primer to understanding our thinking about improving your body mechanics, about improving your positioning, and even addressing common musculoskeletal myofascial pain problems that may pop up during your training. Now, the key here is that because you're already in the Mayhem family, that means that your programming is excellent. You're going to be exposed and ask your body to do all of the things it naturally needs to be able to do, what we call normative range of motion. What you'll see is that in our programming, we are able to take what we call our archetype concept, which are fundamental positions, bookends of function around the shoulders and hips, and basically use that idea to improve your start positions and your finish positions, even in complex movements that seem like sort of are beyond our comprehension, like a full snatch. So what we're going to attempt to do today is to introduce one archetype a day over the course of the week, and then be able to layer in some more sophistication around sort of positional restoration, around sort of improving your mechanics. Now, one of the nice things is that if you have these quick archetype tests at hand, then you can quickly decide, how's my body feeling today? Am I at baseline? Because what I want you to appreciate is that your range of motion is very much a living document based on your environment and your lifestyle and your injury history and how much volume you did last week and today, and did you have to jump in a long car ride to take care of your family. Whatever it is, what we know is that your ability to achieve full range of motion sometimes is a little bit more dynamic than we appreciate. So what we're going to do today is start with a simple concept, which is when we are trying to restore position and improve the body's output, ultimately, we want you to appreciate that pain or no pain is really a poor guise for whether or not I'm working at my full capacity. So what we want you to appreciate is that the thing that we know is that if we teach to the highest expression of the movement, the best expression of movement quality, the best expression of how we teach these movements in the Olympics and gymnastics and Olympic style weightlifting and sprinting, all of a sudden we see that we have all of the information required to understand what our body should be able to do. The key for us is to be able to translate today's stimulus for adaptation into a diagnostic tool. So what you'll see is that as you begin to understand archetypal language a little bit more effectively, you'll realize that every day is an assessment, and that I can choose one position or one aspect of my training, and I can help myself understand how far I am from full capacity or working at less than full capacity. Now, the good news is you don't have to have full capacity or full normative range of motion to begin any program. That's actually a bit of a mistake and a little bit of a lie. What we appreciate is that we all come to this language and come to this movement practice with a little bit different history. But we're always achieving and attempting all to end up at normative capacity, being sure that we can have full access to our basic range of motion, and then we have control through that basic range of motion. So when we define the word mobility, it really ends up being very simple. Do I have the basic range of motion to express fundamental positions, like putting my arms over my head, like hinging over, right? Those are those raw tissue range of motion concepts. And then two, do I have the motor control or technique to express that? So it really ends up being simple. It's not just how stiff are my quads, it's also, do I know what to do with my legs when I have access to those stiff quads? So suddenly, really, the expression of good mobility is more power. The expression of good mobility is more efficiency, sort of less session cost. If two people are exercising, one person has their handbrakes on a little bit because it's a little bit less effective, right? Because they're stiff or don't have access to a full position or don't have full technique. It turns out that athlete will not be able to work as hard as the other athlete who has more sort of effortless access to their positions. So when we're taking our approach, what you'll see is that we like to use what we call a systems approach. So when we're seeing that someone is struggling for position or competency or has, maybe a knee is a little bit sore after workout, what we often ask is, well, is this a muscle dynamics problem? Do we have stiff musculature? Right? And there's a lot of techniques that we know that can address this. And typically, when we're looking at muscle dynamics or sort of musculature, that's really what we used to think about stretching. Just pull on the muscle, it'll get better. But what we know is it's a little more sophisticated than that. We see stiffness in the musculature, we see how the brain interacts with that, neuromuscular tissue. So it's important that we appreciate that muscle is one piece of it. Another piece you're probably very familiar with is what we call sliding surfaces, or looking at the fascia or connective tissue aspects of the human. So how well the skin is sliding over tendons, for example, or how well nerves are running through nerve tunnels, or how my skin articulates, or how muscles articulate with each other. So if you've ever rolled on a ball or roller, typically what you were trying to affect was some fascial change. And if you've ever heard of myofascial mobilization or myofascial release, that's the idea that somehow this muscle connective tissue fascia web implicate how we move very effectively, which is very true. But it also, if we just only address muscles and sliding surfaces, we may miss the joint capsule. So in our language, we created a whole language of banded distractions, where we're trying to use tissue distraction or use a band to access or bias the joint capsule aspect of the movement system. So the joint capsule is a bag of connective tissue or a sac of connective tissue that gives the joint a lot of integrity, right? So all of your joints, even between your vertebrae and your spine, have this joint capsule idea. So if you've ever rolled on a peanut in your thoracic spine, that's actually a joint mobilization. Simultaneously, you may be affecting the soft tissue and some of those musculature between the vertebrae. So what you'll see is that sometimes we're trying to implicate or bias a certain aspect of a part of a tissue system that's part of my movement system, but likely we're working on all three of those simultaneously or to different varying degrees. So is this a sliding surface problem, a muscle dynamic problem, or a capsule problem? But then also, you'll see that buried into all of our work, again, is that we're mobilizing towards the highest expression of movement. And a lot of our movements are all based on the context of the movement language. So if I say push-up, and I've taught on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica, everyone knows what I mean push-up. Well, it turns out the push-up components that we're talking about, interested in, are, can I keep my body still, for example, and can I bring my shoulder into extension? So that's a push-up position in what we call this short lever or bent arm shape. So suddenly I can get into some of the components of the push-up and sort of understand that, hey, I have to be able to have this expression of movement. And also, what are the other movements? Dip, burpee, rowing, running. You'll see that the archetype language helps us make connections between movements so that when we improve one shape in a movement, we're actually improving anything that requires that similar shape. So as we move through that system, again, we also want to make sure that we're expressing the best technique possible, and that you'll see that there's no sort of push and pull or no dissonance between us, between saying, hey, this is the most stable aspect of the system, and we're going to mobilize in those positions that improve your technique and reinforce your technique. So the movement is just as important as the other systems. This is why we want you to start exercising first and then become curious and interested about why you may not have access to the positions. And lastly, it's important and really, really salient to memorize or to mention that we have to be thinking about the environment, that your sleep matters, that your tissue quality matters, that your feeling safe and part of a community matters, and that sort of this environmental considerations, which are easy to sort of say, oh, they're soft, it's really matters is how hard I work out, really is sort of disingenuous. Because what we know is that if I don't have good sleep, for example, my pain sensitivity drops, right? So what we're really trying to appreciate is that when we begin to take a systems approach, usually we're able to improve the performance of all the athletes we work with, from nearly every major league professional sport to all branches of the military to sort of our top of the food chain in terms of sort of our corporate wellness programs. We have access to a lot of people and a lot of systems, and consistently we keep driving in and dropping in our sort of movement model on top of that, and we keep refining our model, and that's what this primer is about. So the first archetype we're going to talk about today is the squat archetype, and appreciating that the difference between a deadlift and a squat is really just the degree of the torso tilt and sort of how forward and straightened the legs are. So are your legs more straight and your torso's forward? It probably looks more like a hinge, like a deadlift or a setup. But if you have to squat down with your knees forward and torso upright, that ends up being a squat. So I'm going to show you what our standards are. And the idea here is, of course, you can squat in a lot of different ways. Wide squat, narrow squat. Some of you are going to have to turn your feet out because you don't have full access to your positions. This is okay. But we're going to show you our first assessment. And then I want to show you some of the components so you begin to understand. What we're going to do at the end of every one of these little mini lectures, introducing a new concept, idea, a tissue mobilization style, is that we're also going to give you the sort of benchmark of archetype, and then we're going to give you a little bit of programming so you can begin to unramp and become comfortable. And ultimately, when you drop into the virtual mobility coach through the Ready State site, you'll understand our language and be able to sort of take a crack at your fixing yourself. What we're trying to do here is not just exercise and eat better. We're trying to put movement and movement quality back into the language of strength and conditioning. So that part of what I'm doing here every day is being in a community, joining fitness, having fun, getting fitter, but also improving my mechanical efficiency and getting my mechanical efficiency back on track if I've taken my eye off it for a minute. So I'm going to bring in our coach Diane Fu for a second here. And I'm going to just show you what we mean by squat. So our squat archetype is simply this. Diane has her feet in any stance that she feels comfortable where she can fit full depth. In this situation, what we're looking for is hip crease below the knee. So all the athletes we work with should easily be able to squat hip crease below the knee, back straight. Now look, we have different leg femurs. If I hand Diane something up top, she's gonna have to keep her torso upright. If I hand it lower or put it on her back, she's gonna lean forward a little bit. So don't get sucked into this tissue, should my torso be upright or not. What I want you to appreciate is that Diane is able to do this squat with feet very straight. She's keeping the ankles in the middle of her feet and she's balanced between the ball and foot of her heel. So there's no changes in her foot pressure during the squat. So as she squats down, that foot pressure doesn't change, that the orientation of her ankle doesn't change. Her squat and my squat might look a little bit different based on our anthropometry, our geometry, the length of our femurs. But can she breathe in this bottom position? Yes, she can effortlessly. And that there's no change in that shape. She can go deeper, but she doesn't have to. This is our quick test. And if you're struggling, thank you, Di, to hit these basic shapes, what you're going to realize is, oh, okay, that's what I should become curious about. Can I improve my mechanical efficiency so that I can then squat more effortlessly? So if I have Diane lay down, head over here, what I want to show you is a couple things. First of all, the components is where people get confused. The test retest is the archetype shape. In this situation, we call it the squat archetype. But really the components of that are, does Diane have full access to her hip flexion? So notice there's no resistance here, and I'm easily able to get her femur to about 135 degrees. So this isn't important right now, but what I want you to see is that as we mobilize, what we're working on is improving her ability to have the components to an effective functioning system. So if I put her hip crease below her knee, leg goes straight up and down, this is a hamstring assessment. So if we're mobilizing hamstrings, you can see that ultimately this looks a little bit like a squat shape, which is really important to appreciate because what we're going to see is the most important thing you can be doing to improve your range of motion is spend time in the positions you value. So the very first video we ever made over 10 years ago was called the 10-minute squat test, which is really all about accumulating 10 minutes in the bottom position of your squat. Why? Because if that's a position we should value and a position that's important for athletics, we should be spending some time in that bottom position. We can ultimately start to get into the nuances and weeds. Does she have rotational capacity in her hip? That's going to be hugely important in terms of choice and how she sets up and the efficiency and freeness of her motion. It's like me trying to put my arm over my head, but I am missing rotation and I can only use my ankle to adjust. My arm should be able to spin and I should be able to handle loads and make adjustments and be creative in my movement. So again, the idea first and foremost is, hey, let's spend time in these positions we value. And then as you work through this primer, you'll be able to understand more effectively, here are some components that we're beginning. What we get asked a lot of is, which mobilization is the best? And what we want to say is, well, what you're really asking there is which mobilizations are less effective or what's not important in the body. Remember, Mayhem programming is a toe-to-head, head-to-toe complete programming. If you have deficiencies or inability to access a position, it will come up. And our idea here is we're trying to expose our inefficiencies, our ineffectiveness, our missing hip range of motion, our incomplete position, our lack of technique. That's what training is. As a side effect, you'll probably become fitter and more shredded and even maybe look better naked. But that is not the goal. The goal is to improve the righteousness of your positions, the effectiveness of your shapes. And what you'll see is that that will improve your effectiveness as a mover in the world inside and outside the gym. So the very first piece of business is we're going to introduce you to our hip flow hip spin up. And this is a simple piece that we're going to see that we can spend a lot of time working on our hip range of motion to improve our squat. A retest idea is that I test something, in this case it's the efficiency of my bottom position of my air squat. I do something and then I retest. And what we're always trying to prove to ourselves is, did this make change? Because if you didn't see change, you didn't experience change, and there was no change. So welcome to the Mayhem Ready on-ramp program. Enjoy the hip spin up. Get a lot of questions about, hey, what do you think about a morning mobility routine? How can I make myself feel better? Now, a couple things about this. One is, for a lot of the sports and athletes we work with in groups where they can't control getting very prepped prior to training or prior to competing, then I'm saying, hey, look, before you leave the hotel room, before you leave the bedroom, get your hips open, get a little moving, get a little breathing. We'll make a little video about sort of our morning breathing spin up separately, but here I just want to show you and give you some ideas around how we think about getting prepped before we leave. And one of the ideas is, if I've touched these in a controlled environment, took a shower, have my coffee, then it's going to take me less effort later on to get spun up. Now, if you go back in time, you're going to see that the sun salutation yoga is exactly this. So if you just did sun salutation for 10 minutes, you're going to kill it. That's great. Breathing practice, movement practice. But I have a little bit more explicit need here. I do less downward dog. I do less some of that stuff. I'm going to just show you and give you an example. Follow along, few minutes, and then once you've done this a few times, have a go at it yourself, okay? So here it is. So the first thing I do in the morning is I just and I've got an injured toe here, so I jam my toe in the Spartan race. But I start just by seeing how the bottom position of my squat feels, right? So this is an easy starting place to see how am I feeling. And from here, and if you can't even get your heels on the ground, don't worry. The goal is to be living at end range. So what I do is I try to push my heels to the ground using my hands, but I don't let my feet collapse. I try to stay in what I think is a neutral, good active foot. And again, working that back into this position and just kind of taking stock of how this feels. Now, I'm letting my back round, so I'm completely relaxed in this bottom position, which is starting to add some lumbar motion. My hip is spending at end range here, and I'm just going to take a second to sort of feeling what's going on. What I'm going to be aware of is that I'm actually breathing. So you could drop into some big breaths here, and at every time you ended up near end range, or you ended up kind of a position of emphasis, do work on taking a big breath. So from this position, I'm just going to stick this right leg out here for a second. Again, I could be holding on to something, I can be using my hands, but now what I'm doing is really closing the single ankle down and closing the hip down. So get into the best position you can, even if that's here. Remember, the goal is to try to get some motion, to try to touch position. I love to stick my right leg out and add some rotation here. And then from this position, after just a minute or so, I'm going to verticalize my shin. And all I'm going to do from this position is I'm just going to work back and forth. So I'm going to get my quads on each time, and what I'm trying to think about doing is getting my body a little bit further over my base of support each time. So I'm just moving, and notice that I'm adding some rotation a little bit. I'm looking where I'm going, but here's what's happening. Foot is straight, quads are on, and I just wobble back and forth until I sit on this leg for a second. So again, kind of just seeing what's going on. There's no wrong position or right position. I'm moving around and noodling, adding a little rotation, getting the quads on from this shape. Then I'm just going to turn this and go right into a very deep lunge. So I'll do it in this position so you can see what's going on. What I'm doing here in this deep lunge shape is I'm just going to wobble back and forth for the front leg, just kind of chilling back and forth, trying to keep the foot pressure even. And I'm just being aware, and if I get to a place where I stop breathing, be aware of that. Can I get that breath on? So just noodling back and forth in this position. I like to put my legs, arms on the ground if I got it. If I got one hand, that's great. The other hand, totally fine. There's no way to win this other than to be spending time in the shape. So now I'm spending time in a lot of leg, hip flexion, but also I got this trailing leg in extension. So watch what I'm going to do here. I'm noodling around. I'm now going to turn, drop this foot down the back, so I'll just go into my step, and then I'm going to look over my shoulder. What this does, as I plant on this leg, is it lengthens this left side, taking some big breaths, but adding some rotation, just looking at this leg. I can still be noodling into different positions. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to go as low as I can, and I'm going to try to get as far away from this leg as possible. So I'm going to try to reach to the other side. So I'm reaching, opening up this lateral side, taking a big breath here, and then just noodling around. And I feel there's some tightness in my hip. I don't know what that is. Is it my underwear? Is it my hip rotators? Is it my hip capsule? Doesn't matter. But I was curious. I'm like, ooh, that feels stiff there. So I'm just going to noodle on it for a second. Now, from this position, I'm already set up for a couple great things. One is I'm going to lift that back leg up and get my quads on and my glutes on. So I'm trying to teach my quadriceps how to work against the tension of the hip. So the goal is to try to get a good quad set, straighten the leg, press your hip to the ground, take a breath. But don't let the butt squeeze, don't let the knee bend. Do the best you can. Leg straight, flex your quads, hard as you can, press that hip to the ground. What I'm doing here is really working on some hip extension in what we call a long lever position. So again, just load that up, flex those quads, get that hip straight, press the hip to the ground, do the best you can, and then just come out of it. You can noodle around, take a break, come back up, flex the quads, squeeze the butt, press your hip to the ground. Make sure you can breathe in that position. All right, so now from this shape, what I'm going to do is I've got my hamstring in a good position. So I'm just going to nice and easy see if I get my quadriceps to flex against my hamstrings. So notice what I'm doing. I'm just touching it. And the goal here is to get the nerves running through the nerve tunnels, get the quadriceps to fight against what may be just stiff hamstrings. My hamstrings are stiff from the work use yesterday. So I'm teaching my brain to fire, and then I'm going to add tension. And I can add tension by pulling the foot back. So go as slow as your nervous system tells you. And you'll see that you'll be like, ooh, slow. But see if you can flex the quad. If you need to come up higher, get it done. And then I start to add the foot, which is going to tension up the whole fascia and the nervous system. So if you're getting hot, nervy, burning nerve pain here, don't add the foot. But should have access to this position. Now watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a little crazy. I'm going to actually tuck my chin for a second. Now this is a big nerve tensioner. And I want to tension my nerve. Belly button is being pulled to the spine. I want to load up this fascia in this big global position. But if I'm getting zingy, respect that. Don't pull on that stuff. Be cool. So I could even push the toe away and flex the quads if I was getting zingy. The idea, again, is to straighten the quadriceps here. But if I can add this tension, I just want to touch it for a second, come out. Touch it for a second, come out. I'm trying to teach my body that this neural tension is okay. It's part of my warm-up. Now, leg falls out to the side. What I'm doing is I'm exaggerating a little bit more on the rotation of the hip now. So I've got a little bit more extra rotation, and notice that I'm noodling, and then I'm going to do what we call informed freestyling, which means I'm going to find the ray, find the corner, and find the vector where I feel restricted. So I'm just noodling around, adding some circles, but this time I can even do some contract, relax, and push into the foot, but I'm being active the whole time. Because I'm not just a piece of meat and balancing, I'm moving and changing and winding. I'm going to look over my side, make sure I can breathe. I can go the other direction. Again, breaking up with my leg and just noodling and feeling, giving this a second to work. Then I'll stop for a second, come back up to kneeling for a second, just get organized, and then I'm going to do the other leg. So again, we start in this kind of split position. And I started just by noodling around, preparing the tissues, trying to get a little bit of the viscoelastic properties of these tissues to work, which means they're going to deform slowly, time under tension. So I'm spending time here, but the whole time I'm being active. I'm not going to just drop into like a pigeon or plow pose and hang out, goose. I'm just going to be kind of moving and thinking about what it looks like to be active in these positions. What's the rotation look like? If you're a movement disciplined person, then you probably read Super Joints by Pavel a million years ago, which is at least, hey, let's add some rotation and put the joints into all the positions. But for me, getting my hips open first thing in the morning is like a secret weapon when I go quickly, need to train or compete. If I'm
competitive surfer and I got to get wound up, you know, and I maybe not can do that in the warm-up area. So I try to get as much covered as I can. So from this position, remember we went elbows to the ground if you got it, wobbling around. We went to the opposite side. Knee goes one direction, hand goes the other direction. Try to take a big breath here. Dropping in, take one more breath. I'm curious about this position because it really does wind up this hip a little bit. So I get some motion in here. Remember how we posted on this hand and just dropped the leg to the ground, took a big breath. Just trying to open up this fascial line a little bit. Just, you know, touching that position, wobbling. We look over, we reached as far away as we could. We looked over the foot and tried to get a little rotation here. Then we are primed for the back. Now, I don't know if I can load my toe in this position because I sprained it in a Spartan race. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze my butt, flex the quads, press the hip to the ground. Whew. Squeeze my butt, flex my quads, hip to the ground. Kind of just come in and out of that position. Flex your quads as hard as you can, squeeze your butt, push your hip to the ground, take a break. And then just repeat that a few times where you can know that your butt is squeezed, your quads are on, and then you're just going to press your hip to the ground for a second. Make sure you can breathe in that position. Fantastic. And now you're already wound up for what? A little hamstring action. So give me some flossing in this position. So now I'm just going to floss back and forth. That feels pretty good. I'm already a little bit warmed up. So watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to add the foot in here. I'm a little tight through the calf, I noticed to myself. So I go a little slower, making sure that I get a discrete muscle contraction at the end. It's just a quick end range isometric, just a little micro hold. I can add the top of the foot. If I'm super mobile, I can put my head on my shin if that feels good. The idea is just to find that place where you have control of the quadriceps. One more, right? We brought the leg into this lateral position, and we noodled around here for a second. You can drop down, wobble around to the outside. Just feel like I got some motion here in this hip. If you get your hips open before you leave the house, life is going to change. Your back's going to feel better. You won't feel as stiff when you get out of the car or after that first meeting in the morning. Turn, look over the leg, get some motion in that foot. Make sure you're breathing. Now I come back. One of the things I want to do, I don't know if I can do it, is I come back to my squat and see how I'm feeling. So for me, this is always my test for what's going on. Does that feel easier and better? Yeah, that does, and it should. I just open up my hips in all these positions. Last thing I like to do is just put my toe on the ground, knee goes straight forward, and what I'm trying to do here is get a good flexion moment through the big toe. So I'm just touching that position. I come back. Kneeling, I can even go, and I'm going to go around my toe because this toe is sprained right now, a couple days ago, but I'm trying to go straight through. But the idea is, hey, up on this position, this Sazen position, right, is actually one of the primal drinking positions, and it's not an accident that it's so important that we can move those big toes. So we're just touching that big toe a little bit back and forth. Again, use your hands. You can balance on that shape. And guess what? Anything after that is gravy. Like to do planks, want to do our shoulder spin up, great. But that is a simple 8 to 10 minute ground flow routine that means that when I leave the house, or if I need to go train or get out of the car and get on my bike quickly, I'm not doing that at the hill in my ski boots, which is not the right time. So if I put my bike on, or I take my kayak on the roof, or I'm about to go do a sport, maybe I don't want to be moving my body for the first time in that situation. I want to be able to go quickly. So touching this while you're drinking your coffee, getting warm, on the days where you know you're going to need to compete or go do something, this is a great spin up. This is what I do when I travel on the road. I do this in the morning before I go down and have breakfast, and at least I've got a little modern movement practice. This is a sun salutation for the modern athlete.